Hello and welcome everybody back to the main stage to our third panel discussion today at our AI conference, which is dedicated to make AI explainable and explain how AI actually impacts the financial services sector. And this session is focused on trust, transparency, and ethics. Of course, a key topic of making sure that AI is implemented correctly. And I'm very happy to have a great panel here in front of me. And the moderator will be Ivana Bartoletti. And Ivana is not just my co-editor for the AI book, but Ivana is also a technical director at Deloitte and responsible for privacy. And in addition to working, for Deloitte, she also is the co-founder of the Women Leading in AI Network and also a published author of her own book, which is focused on the artificial intelligence revolution. So Ivana, we are very thrilled to have you moderate the panel. So what I would love to do now is to hand over to you and introduce our panel members. And I can't wait to hear all your insights and experience. So handing over to you.
Thank you so much, Susanne, and how fantastic it is to be here with you all and to be talking about some of the most important issues affecting the financial sector and financial services right now. And as the world is digitizing and moving at automated at such a rocket speed, especially with the pandemic and all across the world, finance is obviously one area where we are seeing all this progress happening. Alongside all the progress, we are also seeing some key issues coming and becoming more prominent on a daily basis. And the issues around trust, the issues around transparency, explainability, and how we move beyond the simple compliance to ensure that people, consumer, can really trust the products that are there in the financial sectors is absolutely crucial. And this is not just, this is happening everywhere. We've seen over the last decades, we've seen some of the absolute best coming from technology, but we've also seen some bad things happening, the dark side to it. And this is why consumers across the globe are demanding more transparency, and they are demanding to know what is happening to their personal information, and they are demanding this meaningful control about what happens to their data. I would like to start introducing the panel, but the way I want to do this is I want to introduce you very briefly, and then I want you to say what is you think the most pressing issues that we are seeing around trust and in financial services. So, and in particular with the focus to ethics, I would really like you to say to me, what do you think this matters when it comes to financial services? Is that just because we need to build the trust? Is it just because we need to, we want companies to have a competitive edge, and if they want a competitive edge, they really need to take their consumers on board. I just wanted your opinion on why this issue matters, and it matters now. So I'm going to start with Brian, who is the founding executive director at the Hong Kong University of Hong Kong, and so many more things, which is and a real leader in this space. So Brian, would you answer that for me? So why does it matter?
Well, thanks so much for the kind introduction, Ivana, and great to be on this fantastic panel. So I often hark to what I still use as the unfortunate acronym FAT, right? Fairness, accountability, and transparency. And we can talk on about that, but specifically in the area of finance, I think while finance has the great opportunity to be inclusive, it can also be exclusive. Right. So if we are not, so maybe let me take a very brief step back. My background is I was in private practice in Australia and New York, and then I joined Credit Suisse in Hong Kong before I left to join FinTech, RegTech, and LawTech, and then now in academia a little bit as well. So that's my way of background. When I left the law, I set up ACMI, which was after the financial crisis. So for a long time, I was actually looking at the causes of the financial crisis, and part of that was attributed to conduct risk. Right. So at that time, they were talking about the ethics of bankers. Ha ha ha. Do they have ethics? Ha ha ha. Right. And so therefore, through that and my thinking and work there, we were looking at professionalizing the banking industry. Right. And so fast forward. Now we're looking at the application of machines and the the ethics of machines, ha ha ha, right? And so I'm about, so part of it when looking at the professionalizing of the finance industry and finance in general, as you mentioned, Ivana, what is the role of finance in society? So to me, there are few main areas, right? So finance is there to help people save and invest for future needs, right? To help people borrow for their homes and to grow their businesses. Is to help insure against bad events, and it's for market integrity, right? So therefore, for there to be professionalism in finance, it needs to, workers in that space need to address those needs. So similarly, in the case of applying AI in finance, does AI fulfill those needs is one way to think about it. And very often one of the concerns is that through things like credit tech, which I'm sure we'll talk about, if it's not appropriately applied using appropriate data, you may have algorithmic bias intentionally or unintentionally built in. So let me pause there briefly and pass it over.
Brian, this is really interesting, and I certainly want to explore this further with you. In particular, what I like about what you said, when you said what I think, and I'm sure Trish will agree with me, because Trish and I, we're both part of Women Leading in AI, but I think this is, Trish, tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but what I really particularly agreed with Brian is he probably is really saying the most important ethics principle, which is, is AI in tune with the problem that we're trying to solve? Is AI in tune? And this is the key ethical consideration, isn't it? Because a lot of the ethics when we talk about is do we really need this, or are we doing it just because it's technologically possible, or are we doing it just because it's glamorous and out there in the market? So I think, Brian, thanks for saying this, and I want to talk about bias in a minute. Patricia, what do you think?
Well, sorry,
I wanted to introduce Patricia. Patricia is CEO of Just Me Saying. Everybody knows Patricia. So Patricia is the CEO of Beyond Reach Consulting, and also is in the steering committee of the Women Leading in AI, which it's an organization that we both work on, which is a little bit of advertising here, which is a global network of women, not just women. So Brian, you're more than welcome to join, and is to advocate for responsible AI. So having done my bit of advertising, Patricia, over to you.
Fantastic. Just to add to what Brian said, I think it's really interesting that we've mentioned about algorithmic bias, and I will come to that. For me, ethics covers the whole AI life cycle, and particularly in financial services. So we've got to look at the data. We've got to look at the algorithmic intelligence system. We've got to look at the humans that are involved here. And then we've got to look at the outcomes. And we've got to keep looking at those outcomes. So to some degree, I agree. Absolutely. Financial services is focused heavily on conduct risk, the conduct of its people, engendering ethical behaviours to get the better outcomes. And there is an outcome risk here. And that's why we've had these risk-based principles, certainly in the UK with our Financial Conduct Authority has brought that in there. And likewise with data, we've got implementation of GDPR and the Data Protection Act and the UK GDPR that will follow. So we look at data risk in terms of data ethical principles engendered in that legislation. But as one of the previous speakers said today, rubbish in, rubbish out, and that produces risk. And then when you add perhaps a rubbish data set or a not properly accurate data set, or that one that has focused and been modelled based on outliers or maybe a more common, and you introduce AI to that, then you're amplifying some of the problems that are already systemic in the data. And then that's where you start to engender the problem, and not least because there are certain assumptions and dependencies already in the algorithmic system that have been laid upon. So for me, in addition to the fairness, accountability, transparency, the explainability aspect, the ensuring privacy as centric and keeping human centric in that position, is about making sure we've got appropriate diversity and inclusion in our financial services. And that for me stems back to representation and representativeness in the data, in the diversity of people involved in the AI lifecycle, as well as in terms of how representative are the outcomes that are being produced. When we hear of algorithmic intelligence systems that are excluding people on the basis of their gender, or people excluding people on the basis of their accessibility to the tools in the first place because of maybe their ability to access a particular app, particular website, and that may well be age-based, this isn't part of the original social license to operate that the entire financial services sector lays upon, and we mustn't forget that.
That's very good, and this is a key thing that I wanted to really dig a little bit deeper into. So we said, what are the key things which are intended or even unintended and mostly unintended consequences of some of the products that we may put out, especially when we're talking about algorithmic decision making in the financial sectors, is the potential bias. And that could be, as we said, it could be because of the wrong data sets for the data sheets and the fact that not enough and accurate work has been done through that. There is a fantastic document written by Timnit Gebru on which is called data sheets for data sets, which is really talk about the due diligence that we need to apply to that. But also the bias may also come because of many other reasons, including the fact that you are choosing a particular technology in itself. So a technological fix may suffice, but till a certain point. So I wanted to ask Brian, and also please, if you could address also the cultural element of this, because we are based in the UK, you're based in Hong Kong, and I really want to know, how do we make sure that, for as much as possible, when our countries deploy AI, there is the due diligence in place to avoid bias, and this is not just can it be due only to the single financial institution, or is there anything else that we need to do? And I really think this is important on a global scale as well. So can you start talking about this, and then we can have a discussion?
Sure, thank you. So I like the question a lot, because that's something I think a lot about as well, especially being here in Asia. So a lot of the discussion about AI ethics tends to be quite Eurocentric, shall we say, or American. And so and how can you talk AI without China? Right, which has the highest number of AI patents right now, right, and the data sets that are there and the like. So hopefully that's some sort of role that we're trying to play here in terms of bridging that gap. So I'm part of something called the Asian Dialogue on AI Governance. So governance is actually a phrase I prefer to use. So by way of background, I briefly looked at our backgrounds. Each of us have got law degrees. Each of us have got liberal arts as well, right? So I was a politics philosophy. So as I was trying to think through, and then you've got the issue of ethics. There's a great report and website that actually compares a lot of the different ethics principles around the world, right? And yes, there are lots of commonalities and there's some differences, but also you would have, and look, we're all lawyers here, so you can have the same word, but you interpret it different ways, right? Sure. So that's what lawyers do. So now, so how do we deal with, and then the aspect of potential.
We've lost him. Is that me, or is that happening for real?
Yeah, no, we've just lost him.
Oh, Trish, come on, step in. No, what I wanted to say to you is he's back.
Okay, good. You lost contact momentarily.
Right.
So I was just I was talking about cultural relativism, right? So in terms of different regimes, so one of the things I started thinking about, and I started trying to think about a framework, and I'd love to bounce it off you, and something that we're continuing to work on. So I had it published not in the AI book, but actually in the legal tech book that came out afterwards. Right. And I call it the Chiron imperative. So Chiron, named after Homer's, whom Homer called the justice and noblest of centaurs, and the word centaur comes from Kasparov, right, who actually talked about the human and machine together as part of the way to think about it. And so how I tried to think about it was, how do we, especially if we have different worldviews, right, how do we apply different worldviews, different aspects of this human-centered role of AI throughout, right? And again, by way of background, I think of Ivana, yourself, avowed feminist, and Fabian, and then Patricia, you look from a Christian perspective. So these are all different worldviews. And here, you've got a human rights, you've got a status, you've got development rights, and all this. So how do we do that? So very briefly, the way I think about it is I've now divided into 7 categories of how the human role is, right? So firstly, the human as the AI trainer, right? So how is the data collected and labeled? Secondly is the human as the AI user trainer. So as you're using Google, as you're using a lot of their tools, you're actually training inadvertently or otherwise. Thirdly, the human as an AI control, quality control and governance. And that's where, if you like, there's a control, second line of defense type thing, concept. Fourthly, the human as AI explainer or interpreter. So how do we address that aspect of it, and who do we explain or interpret it for? Fifthly, the human as AI creator, again, whether it's the developer, the models or the software, or the tools. Sixth, the human as AI deployer of AI product or tool. So this is the use cases. And last but not least, human as consumer user, i.e., are we going to be, is it going to be like climate? Are we going to, or meat? Are we going to say, maybe, yes, it's out there, but we're not going to use it as a consumer? So to me, it's kind of a framework to try to break down into different discrete parts the role of the human, and to discuss it and discuss the different aspects. And to me, that's one way to think about the overall governance aspect of it all. And hopefully that addresses some of the cultural aspects that you mentioned, because otherwise you will have different people talking about the same thing, the same term. We'll all agree to fairness. Who doesn't agree to fairness? But what does that actually mean, right?
And this is the same in other areas as well, so I mean, I agree, and it's an interesting one, because we are asking ourselves, how do we regulate all this, and especially in financial services? I mean, do we regulate an AI? And I mean, I don't think that this is the right question. I don't think we're talking about regulating AI. I think we're talking about regulating the behavior of people around this, the behavior of developers, the behavior of companies deploying it, the behavior of, that's what we're actually talking about. And I'm not, I mean, I'm just quoting Joanna Bryson on this, when she says, it's not like regulating the eyes, regulating the behavior. And this is where it comes to, the fact that concepts like fairness, like privacy, they can be fairly context dependent. And privacy in China is different from privacy in the US. One is very individual focused, and one is, it's an interesting one. Trish, I just wanted to bring you in now, because I wanted to talk to us about how do you navigate these issues around the fact that, yes, all these things can be very context dependent, country dependent, but at the same time, with the globalized world we live in, with a supply chain and with everything, we do need to have some, whether it's standards or whether it's some, we have to have something that holds us together, and call it governance, global governance, whatever it is. But how do we reconcile the need for taking into account in the context dependent and the marginal appreciation, as we were saying in human rights a lot, with the need for a sort of a general and global approach to this?
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, because we can't easily regulate and then actually oversee and govern a whole wide world. That's a fact. It's a fait accompli. However, just to start from Brian's point about these definitional differences that we have, then how it gets interpreted with our cultural bias, and then our cultural relativism in terms of what that actually means when it gets applied in our context. And I suppose where I see the ability for us to look at this in a global perspective is looking at the outcomes, but also having standards that show us how we should behave, or the sorts of things we should be thinking about on the journey to achieving those outcomes. So if our goal as a globe is to do no harm, to try and create financial services products, fintech products that are AI ethically aligned, and I suppose then the basic question has to be, what's it doing for us? And then what is it doing to us? And by doing questioning what it's doing to us comes to the very 7 points Brian asks us across that life cycle. And I think that's a really brilliant piece. But then to bring it to the operational side of a business, what does that mean across the AI life cycle? Well, you have to look at the design phase, the development phase, the deployment phase, when you've commissioned it and it's out there, and your operational and your monitoring it phase. And then ultimately as well, because there is a great deal of power, there's a great deal of potential bias and discrimination that can go on the decommissioning of a product. No one wants to think about decommissioning when we're talking about new fintech products, but it's a whole AI lifecycle piece. And in that, we need to think about, and this is where I'm involved with the IEEE in creating ethical standards for algorithmic bias, but also ethical certification through the XAI committee. And I think the only way I can see a quick enough response right now, I appreciate all the efforts that are going on at EU level to create regulation of people and practices through AI and what's going forward there. But if we can get the standards to market quick enough, there is a way of standardizing processes, not necessarily the AI processes themselves, the people processes, the considerations, the factors, the vectors, the indices, everything, characteristics that people are to think about, both of the data, how they look at the models, and then how they look at the algorithmic systems and the outcomes they produce, and increasingly introducing, to the governance point, stakeholders that are representative. And I said in the AI book about a governance model, and I agree totally with Brian in the governance. This means it's about meaningful human oversight, which the standards need to bring about, because ultimately someone's going to come, whether it's through IEEE or another organisation doing ethical certification and ethical audits to really benchmark and benchmark what you're doing is in accordance with this at global scale. You're producing the AI ethical outcomes that you want to produce.
Yeah.
And so with that governance, it has to be multifaceted, multi-layered, multidisciplinary, and sometimes your best expert in the room isn't the one with the letter after their name, but to the global point, multi-jurisdiction. We've got to understand that we are creating AI, and even the off-the-shelf AI that's being created isn't in Europe, isn't sometimes in the US, sometimes it's in Africa and it's in deep Asia. And we've got to understand that by doing that, we're bringing with that cultural bias, lack of diversity in some cases, sometimes a greater diversity. You know, Mongolians have quite a very diverse ethnic mix about roles and responsibilities in society, more so than perhaps we do in the UK. So we've got to understand where and how we're buying our AI and really unpacking that to unpack where's the data coming from, what's the data bringing to the table, what's the algorithmic intelligence system bringing to the table, what were the people bringing who were involved with this, how diverse and inclusive were they? Because for some jurisdictions, elements that may well be inclusive in a UK-US audience may be wholly exclusive and would be excluded from a technological methodology like AI and the data sets that feed it and the models that feed it in certain jurisdictions around the world. So we've got to understand the exclusive power, the excluding effect that some of this can have, depending on what jurisdictions are both employing and deploying the AI.
It's great. Yes, totally. And this is really good because it's really important that we take all that into account. I wanted to ask you about something related to what you've been talking about. And in particular, for a moment, I just want to talk to you about trust. And the reason why I want to do this is because one of the things that we're hearing a lot at the moment, especially after we've seen a lot of sort of dark things happening out of technology. You know, we've seen great stuff, but we've also seen some really scary things at the same time, you know. And so a lot of people are becoming more aware and they're familiarizing with I call it the politics of data, you know, the fact that the politics of technology as well, the fact that technology, a technological artifact is not neutral, it's there to really breed the design that the people built in and all that. So moving on to really the specifics of the financial sector. If trust is essential, isn't it? Because ultimately what we're talking about is, for example, if you have an automated system to decide whether somebody's having a loan or not, you're talking about something which is life-changing for an individual. Yeah. So the individual needs to trust that system. And I want to challenge you on this a bit. Is trust about transparency? The reason why I'm saying this to you is because if you, there is, I think, a little bit of confusion in companies around what is the difference between transparency and explainability, what is the difference between transparency and how they communicate this to the public, and how can transparency be meaningful enough for people to trust a particular product? And the reason why I'm saying this is because we, particularly in the West, have grown accustomed to transparency as a privacy notice. transparency has loads and loads of legalistic information, which means really little to the majority of people. And if we want to be transparent, then we can't fail exactly the people who need their transparency the most. So I would like you to address this in financial services. What does it mean to really build trust? And is trust related to transparency? And if so, how much?
Maybe let me start with that one. And I'll be a bit provocative. I think for financial services, it's actually a simple answer because it's regulated. It's not so simple when it's not regulated. So I'll give you two examples, right? So one is, I don't know whether many of you or your audiences were involved with the recent IOSCO consultation.
Yes.
So IOSCO is the regulator of securities regulators around the world. So in FCA in the UK, SEC in the US, FSC here in Hong Kong, and they basically promoted. They had a paper on the use of AI in relation to market intermediaries and asset managers. And so they actually created what in the UK you would call a senior manager regime for everyone in relation to AI use. It was actually pretty darn good. It was completely the whole lifespan that Patricia was talking about, right? So the whole lifespan of it, including a kill switch clause, right? And in some ways, and they had lots of great stuff in it, including explainability aspects, although they fudged who you're actually explaining it to, right? But in general, it means, yes, explain to the regulator because you're regulated, but potentially also to your customers, whatever that means, right? Institutional is different from retail, to your point, right?
Sure.
And so in some ways, if that goes through, in fact, a large segment, now that doesn't account banking. That is just securities markets, right? So because it's regulated, you get trust because the regulator has instilled it that way, right? So similarly in China, the other big news that has recently come out is, everybody anecdotally says, oh yeah, in China and Chinese, maybe they favor convenience over privacy, right? So over the last few weeks, what are the big news? What's the big news out of China? Number one, Ant Financial's IPO got suspended. Yeah. And arguably that was because of, you can attribute lots of different things, but the official reasons relate to the online lending, again, fintech, right, and finance, and the exposure, and ... the use of credit tech, and therefore ensuring and credit limits and the like, right? So they can regulate around that and require reserve limits there. But more importantly, more recently, the privacy there's new privacy laws coming out in China, right? And they recently finished the consultation, and for example, they're prohibiting certain kind of data protection from live streaming, short video sharing, and the like. But more importantly, and I found this quite telling, they use a GDPR style fine. It's up to 7% of revenue. Yeah. So suddenly, it doesn't matter how big you are, it matters, right? So I think. For finance, I say it's actually an easier argument for trust and transparency because you have a regulator that overlooks it. For other industries, it's less so, and so that's my kind of retort to that point.
Trish?
I think I'm going to start because you've mentioned about the position of a regulator, and for me, the position of a regulator gives regulatory impetus. It gives a reason for put budget and resource behind something to an organisation to do things right. And so absolutely having a regulator in there in the first place is a good thing. That is only as good as the rule of law in the country to which it is applying. So provided you've got good standing of your rule of law, good standing of your regulator, then that should be a starting point for building a foundation of trust. But from my perspective, building a foundation of trust isn't just about the regulation, and it isn't just about the transparency, actually. Transparency is a part and parcel of the way that we communicate and explain in plain language to the end user what is this doing for them and to them, as I started at the beginning. And I believe transparency also, to a degree, without, we're not talking about exposing open source code here. We're not talking the deep dive tech as to getting people to game your system. It's explaining what goes in, what it does with it, and what comes out in terms of the end user. They just want to know, here's a counterfactual analysis. If I put A in and B's done here, I get C out. But if I put D here, I get E here and F there. That's about how they can have an element of control over their circumstances. Now, transparency is fundamental for that control. It's about empowering the individual, but it's also fundamental to privacy. And rightly so, you know, it's transparency is an ethical principle in our UK data protection legislation, European data protection legislation. It's also in terms of key facts and telling people about what is this bargain, this conscionable bargain that people are entering into, whether it's a loan agreement, credit agreement, selecting the different types of insurance products that could be available to them, or other ways of managing their personal finances. You know, there are some massively great tools and beneficial tools out there, but it's not just about the transparency. It's about understanding that the organisation you're dealing with also has the responsibility, that they are saying that we are willing to be accountable for what it is that we're doing. And some of that can be simple. It could be by pure review boards, pure feedback loop in the equation. But consumers and users who are using these products can see, oh, so and so's had a really fantastic experience here, and they used it and they rated it a 5, or this other user didn't have a great experience, but the organisation took their feedback on board and then improved their product and service as a result. So there's an element of responsibility and actually, you know, taking ownership before it even gets to the regulatory fine level. Also, it's about understanding, and understanding isn't just about giving people information. It's about making an awareness. It's about really, truly saying to the individual, yes, this is the information you need to educate yourself, and this is how it works for you in real time, in real life, in your circumstances. So really making it explainable and understandable in that way. And for me also, it's about stewardship. So you can see an acronym coming here for trust. Stewardship here, you know, it's about, you know, what's the background history here? How have they dealt with other customers? How have they dealt with my data in the past? How have they dealt with other people's data in the past? How have they been with their other products and services that implement AI? Where's their rep here? You know, and if they can show that they've stewarded well, then that would also engender my trust and any other end user's trust. And then ultimately, you know, it's about the truth as well. And in that truth, I'm really talking about accuracy, and that not only what they're putting in is accurate and that they've checked is accurate, as in pure data accuracy, but what the AI is then doing from it, what insight and inference is being gleaned from it, is also reflective of being accurate and being corroborated against other evidentiary basis. And then ultimately the outcomes produce an accurate outcome for me. So it doesn't necessarily have to be 100% accurate, but the point being is that how organizations have gone about it, but they've had that in mind, that they're not trying to broad brush approach everyone and categorize them into a box that actually does not fit that individual, that they've triangulated the information, they've triangulated the outcomes so that the least harm is being caused here. And I think so there's trust for you. So I think there's an awful lot more we can do. And this then undergirds that social license to operate. And actually, once one user has had good experience, word of mouth, that I'm using this fantastic fintech tool, I really want you should try it. And that's how it works. It isn't about great advertising. It isn't about whatever international trade body they're involved in. It's about word of mouth on the ground.
Yeah.
So what was the acronym? Was it TRUST, TRUST? I missed the beginning one.
Transparency was a...
Got it.
And it's in the AI.
So I wanted to go back to what Brian said. We said, you know, in the financial sector, to an extent, is easier because it's regulated. And I wanted to say yes, but I wanted to ask you another question, which is, yes, it's regulated, but is traditional regulation sufficient to deal with some things that are very much new? So, for example, there are areas, I think, where we are seeing an overlapping of sort of jurisprudence and legal areas. So we are seeing a lot of sort of competition law being overlapping with privacy and emerging with privacy, especially when it comes to some particular areas. We are seeing consumer law being challenged. We are seeing, for example, some practices like personalized pricing, or they challenge the traditional way that we've dealt with things, and maybe they also bring a new challenges around: is there the specific or solely sole areas of the law, is it sufficient to deal with that? Harms are also different, aren't they? The harms are not just individual. There is a risk of collective harms. And the harms are much more difficult to identify in automated decision making, which sometimes are opaque. Discrimination legislation and human rights law can be leveraged, but are they enough to deal with some of the harms that sometimes are very difficult to detect, and they can be much more subtle? So the reason why I'm asking you is because, Brian, you said it's regulated. I'm saying yes, but is that enough, or is there something that is so much, is all the risks to an extent new for us?
So I think that's a wonderful point, and in fact that's one of the reasons, I guess, why this space is so ripe and so rich and so complicated, right? And in some ways also, I besides AI, I work in the distributed ledger space, and in terms of emerging technologies, everybody's scratching their heads. Whose jurisdiction does it fall under, right? And even if you're a regulator, there's comparison between financial regulators. Some have a competition remit, some don't, right? So then some, and so I think what you're getting at, which I certainly have seen, is that the countries that actually have different. So traditionally, when we talk about AI, people put it under the data privacy, the data commissioner's kind of remit, right? But as we all know, it's actually, as you highlighted, it's so much more than that, right? So I think it's important that the different departments, so from a enforcement point of view, a regulator point of view, come together, right? And in a smaller country like Singapore, to be honest, they've done such a great job, right? The data privacy, they liaise with the MAS, and so there's a very much coordinated top-down approach across all the departments, right? It leads up to the Prime Minister's office and all this kind of stuff. Doesn't happen a lot in other countries, right? And it should, right? So that's from a government regulator point of view. Then I think, and I've seen and heard, and regulators and regulation doesn't solve everything. So that's where civil society comes in as well, right? So and also corporates, as so I think. One of the reasons why this area is also complicated is because the actual users of the AI might not just be corporates, i.e. people under the regulators, but might be state players as well, right? And so that adds a complexity to the discussions. And so I think I call it a team sport. You need the right folk at the government, you need the right folk at the industry level, and albeit people might be trying to do the right thing, but as we've seen in the recent news by some of the large big tech companies, you have senior ethics officers who might be leaving as well, right, for various reasons, right? And so then you've got civil society, and these are complicated issues that, as a society, I think all the different stake players need to come together to solve this.
Trish, what do you think?
I absolutely concur. This has got to be a top-down and a bottom-up approach. That coordinated, collaborative, cohesive top-down approach across regulators, across legislative regimes, and really with an eye on the ball for this is a multi-jurisdictional issue. But then that bottom-up approach, because this is about context, isn't it? Each cultural context, each person in their own financial services context has an understanding of what harm looks like to them and in their circumstances. And so it's about engaging a multiplicity of stakeholders to really get that rich understanding and feedback. But what we need for this to occur is a clear regime, and Ivana knows what I'm going to say, is an ecosystem of regulatory and non-regulatory measures, so that you are engaging with each of the different players at the right time, in their right place, saying what can they bring to this equation that produces fair outcomes, is accountable, is transparent, trying to engender the fact that we minimise bias risks, and also to minimise human rights impact. Because ultimately, I know it wasn't financial services, but it wasn't too far away from home. The case with in Holland, when they had a risk indicator system for people defrauding the social welfare and benefits system called Siri, and that was clearly and had a human rights impact. It had privacy impacts of people, data privacy impacts people. So with all of this, we've got to understand, again, what data goes in, how the outcomes, the algorithms are treating it, what humans are in this loop, and ultimately the outcomes. And particularly thinking about the data. And I'm hoping Ivana might have some time to ask about this. But what's the next step to? A number of the fintechs perhaps who are on this conference today will have been very au fait with open banking. But next is open finance. Next is open life. How far is this data funnel going to go that will come into financial services? And when is the context so stretched that context is contexted data is decontextualized?
Yes, that's a really interesting point. And I wanted to really dig a little bit deeper into this. So we've got about 5 minutes left. I'm taking sort of things that come from the questions as well. So I want to ask you this question, which is the following. Get ready. So the question is, when I started privacy law 20 years ago, right? So it was very much about my individual rights. It was very much about, we want to protect our rights, our space, do not interfere. Things have changed over time, right? In the sense that privacy probably has become more related to autonomy, and the fact that, you don't want, a lot of people do not want, as I personally, I'm talking about myself here, as I personally do not want the digital traces that I leave online to be used for making decisions affecting my financial life, for example, right? For some people, this is a very important privacy concept, which is around, I don't want the digital traces that I leave when I navigate and browse the internet then are used to infer things about myself, whether, for example, I'm a trustworthy person or not, because a lot of this stuff is really, at the moment, we don't know whether this is true or not. The speed at which I go from one website to another, could it be a sign of not being a trustworthy person? The fact that I log in at 4 o'clock in the morning to do to check my bank account, is that a sign that I'm a shift worker? Is that a sign that I've got a young baby, or is that a sign that I'm worried about my personal finances? The reason why I'm saying this is because there is a blurred line between not just sensitive data and non-sensitive data, because we are inferring very sensitive conditions around individuals from data that is not sensitive at all. This is clearly changing the concept of privacy, but perhaps this is also changing the concept from individual to group privacy, because you can discriminate against groups because they behave in a certain way. So the question to you is, in 30 seconds each, is the following, do we need to rethink privacy in financial services? Ryan.
In 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
Look, I loved a lot of what you were saying. So I share with you another example that I often give. So I in terms of credit tech, right? So as you may know, social credit is a big deal in China, which a lot of people have different views about. And my example is this. So what's common in China is they have the Hongbao, electronically. That's how Tencent grew, right? And in terms of the apps where people can give money to each other, right, online. So, but if you're doing a credit analysis, if I'm very generous and I give both of you lots of money during Chinese New Year, does that mean I'm a good credit risk or bad credit risk, right?
Exactly.
So that's the example. And again, I'm sure different algorithms might weight that differently, right? And who's behind that and understands that? So I think the long and the short is that, and metadata and the like. So I think
Exactly.
in the East, anecdotally, there's a better understanding of collective rights, right? So I think what you are alluding to may be more akin to what people in the East, generally speaking, are more familiar with in terms of collective rights. And the example I like is that, you know, I can go out there and I'm like you, quite sensitive. I'm not on Facebook much and the like, and careful about what I post. But other people post stuff and they tag me. So, you know, what does that mean, right? So I think it is something that we need to think harder about, and how do we contextualize that. To Patricia's earlier point, I loved a lot what you said as well. But I think the thing I struggle with is consent. It's like, you know, as we're lawyers, it's all the fine print, right? So how do we really understand it, and do people have the patience to read it? Or is it just the lawyers that read all the fine print? I'll leave it at that.
Yes, totally. And you're totally correct. I mean, there's nothing I couldn't agree more in relation to the consent model. I mean, we should have a meeting to talk about the failure of the consent model. But anyway, the Trish, over to you.
I agree. You know, consent is from a lawyer's perspective, a nightmare. As a privacy person and in AI ethics, I so want consent to be up there because it's part of the transparency. Consent is revocable at any time, makes it a nightmare to manage. But I think in terms of that customer journey, because it's a tension and trade-off with the friction, it introduces friction. So it has to be contextual, it has to be in transaction as part of the ongoing messaging, but short enough to convey the right amount of information and keep someone in the loop, and not so long that it makes them fall out of the process and causes friction for people not to proceed with a transaction or a credit or a loan agreement. I think we need more controls and more understanding about the data and information, not just the data, the kind of the meaning that is given to this data through inference and insight that is gleaned, whether it's done through machine learning and pattern recognition in that, or whether it's done through humans bringing it into the equation, that there's a correlation between the way, how frequently you hop from site to site, or the timing of you going on and doing online shopping, or, you know, what that actually means, and whether or not we need to categorize that. I think that's too broad a brush approach, but we do need to consult people more and understand truly, one, what it is that is being said about them, so that they understand it and can inform that appropriately. So it's triangulated information. Yeah. But then secondly, that they have an option to opt out from it, and that they don't actually have to give it without causing a privacy premium, i.e. people having to pay to not share that information, or a privacy poverty for those that don't share it, and having every information that's available freely being used against them or for them and against them. So I think we've got a real challenge here. I can't solve it overnight. And also to your point, Brian, about, you know, we certainly in the West, look individualistically. And actually, sometimes harm and impacts to privacy and autonomy and agency aren't necessarily seen in the individual picture. It's about seeing in the group collective picture and how a group is being dealt with. And you don't necessarily get to talk to each other in that group unless there is that feedback loop that I mentioned, in terms of transparent review boards and ability to for people to comment and see improvements in the system. So I think group rights and group privacy will have to come into a clearer picture, but it's understanding where are the reasonable controls over inference. Should we, to Professor Sandra Vakta's point from Oxford University, think about in terms of the right to a reasonable inference? Because when we go to these points of insight and inference and the use of metadata and other data sets that perhaps are outside of the financial services context, we've then got to ask, you know, well, where's the redress? How can we go about rectifying this if an incorrect insight or inference is taken, or indeed one that ultimately either is discriminatory, biased, or exclusive in terms of excluding people from financial services completely?
Yeah, that's very true. So I am having to close this, and I'm very sorry because I could go on all day, and you're very, you're very nice people to be on a panel with, and I'm really hope we can do another one because there's so much that I want to ask you. But anyway, I'm going to close on this. So that what I wanted to say is thank you for being on the panel with me. Thank you to all those we've joined, and obviously the issue of trust and transparency, and they are going to be so relevant moving forward. The issue of privacy is going to become more relevant as well, particularly because a lot of the biggest ethical decisions that we will have to make, they do relate to the use of personal data. And so that's how privacy and ethics, in my view, really intersect, and why we have to deal with both of them together. And what would be really nice to see is really to move away from sort of Western-based approach on ethics that we are seeing dominating, and that is problematic in many different ways. And well, I hope to Patricia, we need to deal with the women leading in AI is to really make sure that we do that moving forward. And so hope you enjoyed this panel. Thank you, Trish and Brian, for joining me, and I'm going to hand over to Susanne. Susanne? We keep going if she's not coming. Moment of panic. Susanne, are you here? Nobody's taking over.
Maybe they want us to talk more.
Yeah, maybe they've ditched the whole thing and said, no, let's just have Trish, Brian and Ivana to keep us going.
Well, if we had any questions, we could, from the Q&A, we could answer a few of those while we're waiting.
There is an interesting question about privacy technologies and how they can act together on the consumer side to disrupt this domain. Brian, would you have anything to say on that?
So okay, I have a few different hats where this is concerned. So one of the things I promote is RegTech, regulatory technology. So RegTech is great for from a fintech. I call it the secret sauce. So fintechs, financial institutions, and VASPs all need RegTech for legitimacy, for trust, right? And especially after the FATF kind of guidance in relation to that. So I think increasingly we will find a tension between, so in the past, one of the call signs I used to have was, the great thing about that ecosystem is we're all working together to combat financial crime. In this ecosystem, one of the call signs that says, well, the good thing is we're all still human, so we're here to balance our relationship with machines. But increasingly with I think we're having this concept of privacy coming through. So the concept of fighting financial crime is now more muddied with sanctions being politically driven. And so it's not as clear as we're just going after mafia and child pornographers and the like, right? It gets a little bit more complicated. But then there are aspects of privacy as well in terms of the rights of the individual versus the state. So so FATF and financial regulators do not like the privacy technologies for various reasons, and I think that's going to be a tension point going forward.
Yeah. Sorry, Susanne, do I have 1 minute to let Trish answer this question as well? I can't hear.
Please.
Oh, brilliant, Trish.
So interestingly, I'm not so au fait with privacy enhancing technologies myself to comment on that. So I'm very happy for Brian to have led the way on that, and very useful insight that it's useful and is for RegTech, it's a legitimacy point. So I really appreciate that.
I mean, for the issue with privacy enhancing technology, which is one of my favorite topics, and now we move away from privacy engineering to privacy enhancing technologies, we could do Susanne, maybe we could do a seminar on this. It's a special one on privacy enhancing technology in financial services. At the moment, they are still. I would like them to be more available for organizations, and they're not, because they're still very expensive, and also they're quite slow, and it's like having a computer from the 40s sometimes to deal with a huge amount of computing that is needed right now. Anyway, we had some extra time, which was great. Susanne, over to you.
Fantastic, Ivana. Thank you so much. And thank you, Brian. Thank you, Trish, for a fantastic panel discussion. And I think really showing all of us how subtle this topic is of ethics, of transparency, of trust. And it's not an easy one to actually understand. And you did a great job now to holistically describe, the issues which we face and providing solutions, how to analyze it and how to deal with it. So this was super, super relevant. So thank you very much for that. And now I would like to invite you all to join the first film on the future of FinTech. And it's a co-production between FinTech Circle and ITN, the ITN TV studio here in the UK. And it's a 1-hour film talking about case studies about great FinTech companies, how they have revolutionized, financial services, about how the future could look like and what is already being done at the moment. So it's a 1-hour film which will be showcased now on this main stage. For those of you who might have seen the film already, it just came out, a week ago. But for those of you who've seen it already, please feel free to join us in the networking session. So on the left side, you've got the lounge button. If you click on the lounge button, you come out to the networking session where you can literally sit down on a table, and other attendees can join you on the table. We can just have a chat. I was just doing this in the other break with some other attendees, and it's fantastic. It's like almost like in real life, we're sitting down and having a chat on the table with new people we've not met yet. And the arena is the other option you could do if you want to meet our exhibitors. So if you want to speak to Moody's, if you want to speak to the ITN team, so if you want to join, for example, our next film next year, because we will work on a second edition of the Future FinTech film, please reach out to ITN. Also, if you want to speak to the AI journal, to our FinTech Circle team as well, so you can go and meet everybody there, and also the AI Meet team, which is a fantastic platform which we're using. So these are your options, either the film, if you want to watch the film, just stay here and it will start in a few seconds. If you want to do the networking, go to lounge. If you want to talk to our exhibitors or ITN, please do that via the arena. So that's all your options. I'm very happy to have you all with me. It was a great conference, and I will be also doing all those things. I might see you in the networking session or in the arena, and I'm looking forward to meeting you all. And if I don't see you anymore in person, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today at our xAI conference. And thank you again very much, Ivana, for chairing this fantastic panel, and for Patricia and Brian as well to join us. So thank you so much, and we will switch over now to the film.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.